Hello everyone, and welcome back to Tokyo on Fire. Today is July 7th, 2016. On Sunday, just a couple of days ago, 20 hostages were murdered in Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh. This has caused a huge problem for Japan's defense posture and their foreign policy. All of the victims were members of JICA, Japan's overseas development arm. Michael, you followed this story very closely. It's had huge ramifications.
Oh, it has huge ramifications, but we should clarify. When we're talking about all the victims, we're talking about all of the Japanese victims, which was seven individuals. And then there were victims from one from the United States and then a group of Italians who were unfortunately caught in this restaurant in Dhaka.
Two of them were students from Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia.
That's right. And this killing, which has been part of a whole series of ISIS either inspired or commanded events all around the world during Ramadan, we should hope that they finally, now that Eid al-Fitr has passed, that this Tet offensive of ISIS has passed as well. But we can't be sure of that, and certainly the government of Japan can't be sure of that.
Right.
What happened was that these were consultants to JICA. JICA is the Japan International Cooperation Agency. It's the international face of volunteerism and helping people internationally, people of low incomes, that normal aid programs don't do. Japan actually sends personnel, and JICA is the training area and also the organizer of that.
Right. Well, JICA belongs to the Foreign Ministry. The Minister of Foreign Affairs was at the tarmac when the bodies were unloaded.
And the Foreign Ministry very much works with JICA in order to develop programs for lower income countries and people with lower incomes in middle income countries to use Japan's human resources to reach out.
Well, they've done a great job in Bangladesh, haven't they?
They've done a great job in Bangladesh, and they've done a great job everywhere else. No one has anything bad to say about JICA volunteers.
It's actually one of the ways Japan practices foreign diplomacy, isn't it?
Well, if we use the term of Joseph Nye, soft power, it's Japan's soft power arm. It definitely puts a very, very attractive face on Japanese action. Whereas perhaps an organization like JETRO, which is a little more aggressive.
And JETRO is somewhat the development arm or the outreach arm of the Ministry of International Trade and Development Sciences.
Now METI, yeah.
METI, right.
So it has more of a coordination and it has even a defensive side to it, whereas JICA is entirely open and giving. There's really not anything that Japan gets out of JICA except, yes, there are a few contracts, but mostly it's simply a general aid program. And
well, it's tied aid. I mean, it's been criticized before as being too tied to Mitsubishi and selling the tractors, and the cement will come from us. But still, overall, I think it's generally highly regarded in developing countries.
It's highly regarded in developing countries, and also that it's really Japan's soft power. It really is a way for Japan to reach out. Now, it is also where some of what I consider the most impressive individuals of Japan end up.
Sure, they gravitate to, they're those kind of people.
Yeah, it's not a high-paying position. It's a hardship post because people who are actual members of JICA, the persons who were killed were consultants to it. But actual JICA employees have a very difficult time because they go on 3-year tours, and if they have family back home, and they're sent to some country, Kenya, for 3 years, there's the separation. The children have nowadays we have Skype and such things, but it's really a set of individuals that are truly impressive, not only in their internationalization, but to in their dedication.
Did they travel on a diplomatic passport?
JICA people, no, they travel simply on, as I know, for what I've heard, is that it's just simply as citizens. So it wasn't that they were necessarily part of the diplomatic group. And I would think that very difficult for them to be listed as diplomats and do the things that they do. Because they are really on the grassroots level, whereas diplomats have to have a certain distance and have to be protected. These JICA volunteers are basically unprotected. And indeed, in places like Afghanistan, whether JICA should be there or not has always been a question. Now, for Bangladesh has been seeing increasing violence, and there was a sense within the Japanese government that there were indications that there was a deteriorating security environment in Bangladesh prior to this incident. They acted on, in some ways, seemingly some staff members were actually returned home, but
it was something of a
it was
alert out?
but it was completely out of the blue. You know that, and it's one has to talk about the attackers as well. Affluent, well-educated, internationalized individuals.
It's a scary thing, isn't it?
It bears out the theory that we're not talking about poverty, a reaction of have-nots versus haves. These were haves within their own society and even had time in universities in other countries. These were persons with identity and power issues that they were obviously led by some sociopath down into this hellhole that they created. And that has been a real shock to Japanese. The headlines have been, these were all elites. You know, these people were all members of their local elite. How could this, you know, we've been told that, you know, this is the resentment of the poor and we have to give money. And so JICA's position actually can be seen as being undermined because this aid to the poor was supposed to have an anti-terrorist component. We should talk about, of course, what Prime Minister Abe and terrorism in a general sense, though.
Okay, well, in a reaction to this, I mean, the Japanese said we should bind up with the Italians and put together some sort of a security force or something like that. They didn't even say retaliatory, but some sort of a force where they can protect these kinds of individuals.
Okay, we have to be completely open. There's no such thing as a quick reaction force here. There's no special forces that Japan can send to anywhere in the world to rescue hostages.
Well, even the Minister of Defense, Nakatani, said the other day that they don't even have a defense attaché assigned to the embassy in Bangladesh.
That's right. And they have no intelligence capacity that's worth talking about in primarily Muslim countries. They did talk about it in terms of the situation in Syria, where we had the execution of the two Japanese journalists, but nothing really exists, and nothing is ever going to exist, in my opinion.
Prior to this, in Algeria, about 10 Japanese were murdered at a refinery.
Yeah, in the first year of Abe's premiership, yeah.
And that caused a huge shockwave throughout the defense ministry and also the foreign ministry. What has been done since then? I mean, that might tell us what is going to be done after this.
In the immediate aftermath of that, the Abe government passed legislation regarding the ground self-defense forces. Now, the air self-defense forces and the naval assets, the maritime self-defense forces, had the ability to go to countries to evacuate Japanese citizens. But there was no capacity for ground self-defense forces to get into vehicles and drive around and pick people up. That legislation filling in sort of that hole was passed. And it was controversial because there are still extreme pacifists in the Diet and also in the general society who don't want the GSDF on the ground in any country. But that's all that we've seen. There's been nothing beyond that, and now we have the Bangladesh story.
Well, the Prime Minister's office has been beefed up somewhat. Don't they now have a counterintelligence unit that's inside the Prime Minister's office as well?
But they were going to do that anyway. It may have been accelerated a little bit. It might have helped in getting the legislation for the National Security Council going. But
when it comes to boots on the ground and actual protection, I mean, this was in a Tony area of Dhaka. A lot of embassies were in the neighborhood.
And no other country was able to have its forces there. The Italians were being killed as well. It's just, and the Italians certainly have carabinieri who have experience and also members of their armed forces in that would be able to do some kind of military action, which Japan has zip. It doesn't have in any way. And of course, they weren't there either. The questions of sovereignty and the ability of local forces, whether it exists or not, to take care of a situation, that's one of the things that Mr. Abe, before he became prime minister, could rail all he wanted about Japan's impotence and it has no ability to reach out and save people.
Right.
And he did in his 2013 book, Toward a New Country. He railed at Japan's impotence in a Dhaka incident back in the 1970s, that we didn't have the ability to save, in this case, it was a hijacked airline.
Red Army.
From the Red Army faction.
Long time ago.
Long time ago.
1974.
But that's a crucial and seminal moment in his life, psychologically, that incident where the Japanese government folded, paid ransom, let the hijackers fly away, that to him was unconscionable weakness. Now that he's prime minister himself, he's finding it's a lot harder, and being PM involves a lot of sitting on one's hands,
right?
Which and just bearing it, and then when things go really badly, come and collect the dead, and that's it.
Well, a lot of times when you are in this kind of situation, you're looking for a place to point your finger, and it's awful difficult because most of the time, the fingers are actually pointing at you. What kind of protection, what kind of forward planning, what kind of crisis management did you put into place?
The interesting thing about this, all of this, is that the reaction of the opposition, which is currently engaged in electioneering for the House of Councilors election, remember when the 2 journalists were killed?
Right.
The opposition immediately accused Abe of having instigated and stimulated ISIS to executing them by declaring a joint front with other countries against ISIS.
And a pronouncement that we have aid money to go with this as well.
That's right.
And that was the trigger.
That was a trigger, they said. In this incident, no one has in any way linked Mr. Abe to the incident itself, even though the attackers say they were ISIS-inspired, and Japan is one of ISIS's enemies, according to ISIS. This is, I think, a major change, or at least maybe it's only due to the House of Councilors election, but I should hope that it's not. I think that there's a greater acceptance that this is a worldwide struggle, and yes, Mr. Abe spoke too glibly, perhaps, in the past, but he has not been said, no one came out and said, these people died also because of what Abe said 2 years ago, which would have been a cheap, easy hit, and they haven't
Nobody
done it.
touched it.
Nobody's touched it.
Right. We've talked before on this show about potential terrorist attacks happening here in Tokyo or in Japan, especially as we gear up to the 2020 Olympics, and that looks very unlikely. Perhaps people are thinking it's easier to hit Japan outside of Japan, and I think that this incident shows that that's probably a working strategy.
It's probably true. Japanese are very visible wherever they are. It's not like they can blend in many of the instances, and it's certainly in the case of the JICA volunteers. They stand out like a sore thumb, and there is really no security. It's not like the United States can actually come in and smash somebody that hurts the United States. In the case of Japan, you have to take the hit, and
it's not part of that umbrella, is it?
It's not part of the security umbrella provided by the United States, and that reality is going to make it harder to recruit good people into Japan's soft power projection arms. And that's something that the government has to think about, especially since it wants to have Japan. This Abe administration has been desperately trying to increase and enlarge Japan's footprint around the world.
Right. Well, our sorrow and empathy goes out to the victims and their families. It's a sad thing that happened in Dhaka. It's unlikely that something will happen very soon about protecting Japanese that are traveling abroad, projecting Japan's soft power, but we're going to be watching this one. Please stay tuned.